The Walker Bay wine district, right down on the southern end of the African continent in South Africa, has developed a global reputation for some really stunning Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. But despite the fact that this region in the New World is competing with a region like Burgundy that has over 2,000 years of winemaking history, Walker Bay really only planted its first vineyards in 1976 and had its first wine of origin registered bottling in 1981. That's a wine history of less than 50 years. Now, the estate to bottle that first famous bottling was the Hamilton Russell Vineyards, and the wine was the Grand Vin Pinot Noir 1981. A bottle of that very first vintage sold for R5.95, or the equivalent of about 30 US cents. The current vintage of that same wine sells for about 800 Rand in South Africa and for about $50 in the United States. Now, it's worth mentioning when discussing Hamilton Russell that were it not for its founder, Tim Hamilton Russell, there would not even be a Walker Bay district. Because as the first man to plant vineyards and see the potential and eventually bottle wine, he was the one who had to work with the authorities in order to create and formalize what was then the Walker Bay Wine Ward. As his son Anthony Hamilton Russell explains to me, the original boundaries for this Walker Bay Wine Ward revolved around 3 rivers, and that was the Onrus River, the Klein River, and the Bot River, and the ward extended all the way up to the northern end of their catchment areas. But what about Hemel Aarde? I hear you cry. Well, Hemel Aarde is not a wine district or a wine ward. It's actually a collection of 3 wine wards. That is the lower Hemel Aarde Valley, the upper Hemel Aarde Valley, and the Hemel Aarde Ridge. And they came much, much later. In fact, Hemel Aarde Valley Upper and Lower only came into being in 2006, and the Hemel Aarde Ridge took another 3 years to be formalized, finally coming online in 2009. Interestingly, Hamilton Russell Vineyards' very first winemaker was one Peter Finlayson, who later went on to found the now globally renowned Bouchard Finlayson, another pioneering producer in the region. Now, while 1 or 2 of the original producers has ceased to exist, for the most part, that wave of pioneers is still doing incredible things in the valley. But quite excitingly, there is a new generation that is coming through that are producing incredible level Pinot Noirs and Chardonnays. And if you want to know what these young generation winemakers are doing, then track down bottles like the Tesselars d'Ars Pinot Noir or the Crystallum Cinema Cuvée Pinot Noir, both grown with fruit planted in the Hemel Aarde Ridge. Or you can move slightly down the slope to the upper Hemel Aarde Ward and track down producers like Newton Johnson and Storm and Restless River. We're taking a little deep dive on Walker Bay Pinot Noir because today's hand drink solar wine of the day is the Julien Schaal Mountain Vineyards Pinot Noir, made by the delightfully glamorous jet-setting winemaking couple of Julien and Sophie Schaal. As the name suggests, all the fruit for this wine comes from the Walker Bay district, but we can be a little more specific and say that all the fruit comes from vineyards planted in or around the Hemel Aarde Ridge Ward, which is the highest of the 3 Hemel Aarde wards. Incidentally, if you enjoy staying up to speed with these sorts of topics, South African wine history, South African wine science, South African winemakers, then be sure to subscribe to our channel and give us a like, as it does help more people like you to see our content. So we know that the fruit for this wine comes from the highest lying ward and vineyards in or around there, the Hemel Aarde Ridge. But we can also say that there are actually 2 different blocks. One faces towards the Babylon Mountains and the other sits atop the ridge. So the aspect is slightly different on these 2 slopes. Interestingly enough, the very first vintage of the Mountain Vineyard Pinot Noir by Julien Schaal was actually named as such because the vineyards came from the mountains around the Elgin Valley. But seeing as these new Walker Bay vineyards are equally mountainous, the name is allowed to stay. Julien and Sophie Schaal are a delightful pair of wine nuts who make wine both in Alsace and here in South Africa. In Alsace, Julien releases a range of deliciously nerdy Grand Cru Rieslings, which are separated according to the soils in which the vineyards are planted. And Sophie also has her own range of Sophie Schaal wines in Alsace. Then here in South Africa, there is the Julien Schaal range, and that's where this wine comes from. But Sophie Schaal also has her range available in South Africa, which is called Born of Fire, and you have to look out for those. But even though they may have 2 distinct ranges of wines here in South Africa, they make almost all of their winemaking decisions together. So you really are getting 2 minds rather than 1 in any bottle of Julien or Sophie Schaal wine. Now, whenever a husband and wife make wine together, the immediate question is, oh, but what about the tension? So let's see if we can smell it in the glass. Well, I mean, this wine is cleaner than a Cliff Richard Christmas album, so one can only imagine that their relationship is incredibly peaceful. Really, it's a superbly pretty nose with amazing elements of rose petals, red licorice, cherry, lifesaver, even a little touch of pink musk. Now, when we take a sip, well, unbelievably, that palate actually manages to deliver on the rather tall order of building on the already incredible nose. So working with those really lovely candied aromas, the palate carries quite an intense sort of blood orange, juicy citrus acidity, along with sort of spiced orange peel. And then towards the end, as the candy element and the citrus fade, it's joined by really quite tart cranberry and sour cherry elements, which leave your mouth feeling super fresh at the end of every sip. For my money, this is a supremely classy little beastie, and I would say a really big step up from previous vintages. So I look forward to what 24 and 25 have for us in the future. Finally, for those of you who want to go a little deeper, I've left a link to 2 different videos, both on really quite different style Pinot Noirs, because Pinot Noir in South Africa is kind of an emerging truth and various regions are still figuring themselves out. So have a look at either one of those and it'll give you a deeper idea of what winemakers are doing with Pinot Noir in South Africa.